For those of you that don't know my work, I specialise in blending new magic with theatre and storytelling. And I'm quite interested in, magic's traditionally very male-dominated, and I'm quite interested in playing with those stereotypes as a woman and finding new ways of expressing magic through performance. So I'd like to talk a little bit about my new show, which has already completed the first phase of creation. It's called Identi-Tea. Funny enough, it's about identity and tea. And it's a very small-scale piece, and I recently premiered it at Salisbury International Arts Festival. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about the process behind the making of the piece, and also about where I'd like to take it. So identity has been a bit of a theme for me lately, as I've been spending a lot of time living in France. And I've really noticed how, when taken out of your culture, how much your identity really affects you. And I'm currently studying new magic at the Centre National d'Art du Cercle in Chalon, which is actually just like being at Hogwarts. It's totally brilliant. And whilst at Hogwarts, I discovered this amazing old magician's tradition of Western magicians to dress up Chinese and transform their identity. And there were quite a few of them around the turn of the century. Akito, Qingling Su, Fu Manchu, just to name a few of them. And so I thought it would be interesting to take that as a starting point for the piece. And I recently spent time in China, in Shanghai. I was performing at the World Expo last year. And I spent quite a lot of my time off going around the old tea houses of Shanghai, of which there are many, and sampling all the lovely different teas that they've got there. And the Chinese kind of treat their tea very much like wine. They're real connoisseurs with it. And whilst in the tea houses, I became really inspired by these women who were called the Shanghai Girls. And they were around in 1930s Shanghai. And they were kind of a bit like the Chinese version of geisha, except that they were real figures for women's freedom at the time, because women in China then had just come out from having bind feet. And these women were a real far cry from that. And they were often musicians and singers, and I found out that they were sometimes magicians. And so I was really inspired by those women. And so I decided to use the setting of an old Shanghai tea house for the performance. And luckily I had the idea for the show whilst in China. Would have been a bit of a shame to have the idea after I got back. That enabled me to have silk dresses made, the chi pao, which the Shanghai girls used to wear, with lots of hidden pockets for the magic inside them. And to buy lots of lovely oolong tea and the tea set and all the things I needed to make the show. And so I perform the Chinese tea ceremony and do close-up magic using the tea objects. And the setting's quite informal. People come and sit down, have a cup of oolong tea. And it's a little bit of an exchange as well. And people get a chance to talk about if they've ever settled anywhere else and how that's affected their identity. But above all, I think it's a homage to a magician in particular who was called Theodore Bamberg. And he was a 6th generation magician from this very old magical dynasty called the Bambergs, which stretches right back to the 1600s to the alchemists. And they used to pass down the secrets from father to son for generations. And the 6th generation magician was called Theodore Bamberg, and it was 1900. And he was deaf from a childhood illness, and so mute. And he found that his act was somewhat lacking in flair. And so, searching for a solution, he boarded the Orient Express to Shanghai, where he had silk robes made, probably with lots of hidden pockets as well, shaved his head, he even plucked his eyebrows, and he completely transformed his identity, and he became known as Akito. And his career was changed overnight. He toured all around the world, with his family, who also joined him on stage, also adopting Chinese dress. Even his little son, David Bamberg, who was just 4 years old at the time. Now, David Bamberg grew up to become a very famous magician in his own right. He became the legendary Fu Manchu. Now, Fu Manchu had a daughter called Dorothy, and not much is known about her life. So I've taken the character of Dorothy And as I said earlier, the secrets were passed down from father to son, but not to daughter. And so Dorothy, fascinated by magic, hid underneath the table, absorbing the secrets as her brothers rehearsed. And she rehearsed diligently in her bedroom and was lucky enough to be able to practice her magic in the rather salubrious old Shanghai tea houses of 1940s Shanghai. And so in the show, I tell the story that I just told you. And I use an old classic magic trick called the bill switch, which some of you might have seen. And it's usually performed with a note, such as a £20 note, which is then folded, and when unfolded, it becomes a £50 note. But rather than use a note, I use a photograph of Theodore Bamberg, as he was before. And then, as it's unfolded, he becomes transformed into Okito, which in turn goes up in flames and turns into a teaspoon, which represents me in the old Shanghai tea house, performing magic and serving tea to the customers. And we play quite a lot of games in the show with the audience, using a bit of mentalism, a bit of mind reading. But I try as much as possible to make the public the protagonists, so any predictions that are made by them, which they then get right. And I also use the transformation of the objects as a metaphor to talk about transforming identities. I've made a little slideshow of the show, and after that I'd just like to summarise with how I'd like to develop the show.
Down through dreamy Chinatown, the home of King Ali. It's fine, I must declare, but now I'm going where I can see the real thing. I'll soon be there in a bamboo chair, for I've got my from here to Shanghai. Just picture me sipping oolong tea, served by a Chinaman who speaks the way of high. I'll eat my chop soup with a pair of wooden sticks, and I'll have him sing lead doing all his magic tricks. I'll get my from a pale pig's head.
So this photograph is taken at Salisbury International Arts Festival, where I premiered the show. And there I was lucky enough to have absolutely perfect conditions. It was a beautiful sunny day, no wind. It was by a stream with swans and everything, and it couldn't have been more perfect. It was really nice. But however, as we are all too aware, the great British summer doesn't often give us perfect performing conditions. So there's two ways that I'd like to develop the show. One of them is I'd like to purchase a small folding marquee, but one of the new ones that are quite light to travel with and are easy to put up. Firstly, to give protection from the elements. Secondly, just to up the scale of the piece a little bit, just to give it a little bit more presence on the street, and also to protect the angles of magic, which are important. So I'd like to do that. And secondly, I'd really like to work with a director for 2 weeks, just really to develop the character and just to get all those lovely little quirks and ticks and things, you know, that will really give the piece the depth it deserves. So I'm looking for co-producers to help me do that. Also looking to fill up the diary for next year. So if anyone's interested, come and see me later for a cup of tea.